Chapter 7 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alexander in Egypt, 332 through 331 BC. Darius had sent again to Alexander, offering to divide his empire with him, and suggesting the Euphrates as the boundary. Alexander must return his royal captives, and should receive 10,000 talents, over £2,000,000, in the hand of the daughter of Darius. Parmenio ventured to say, "I should close with those terms if I were Alexander." He received the scornful answer, "And so should I if I were Parmenio." None of the followers had the slightest suspicion that Alexander was burning to push on to the world's end, over Media, Hyrcania, Bactria, Sogdiana, the Hindu Kush in India, to the ocean. He sent answer to Darius that he could not offer what no longer belonged to him, and prepared to leave Syria. Before he went, he organized Syria and Phoenicia as he had done Asia Minor, leaving Parmenio to administer Syria until his return. Greece was plunged in despair at the news of the Battle of Issus, and various Lacedaemonians, Thebans, and Athenians, who had joined the Persians and were captured at Damascus, were in great fear, but were treated with great mildness, the Thebans being at once liberated. The conqueror was glad of this chance of clemency toward men who, through his action, were without a city. From the immense treasure taken at Damascus, the Macedonians tested their first of the sweets of Asiatic luxury, and they were already dreaming of the delights of sacking Susa and Babylon. For those who survived, the prize seemed indeed worth it. They little dreamed that in the few short years they were to spend in obtaining wealth, the strength of manhood would become exhausted in their veins, that most of their veterans would have fallen by the way, and their young men become old men through their superhuman exertions, and it was a paltry pittance that in the end those who survived were to take back to Macedonia. From 525 BC until this day, the immemorial civilization of Egypt has been under the control of foreign powers, Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Turk, and Britain, and from its position and fertility, it has always proved a valuable possession to its owner, although from 525 BC until this day, religious questions have always created difficulties between governor and governed. Difficult as it is now for Britain to administer a country largely Mohammedan, it was just as difficult for Persia to keep order 2.5 millenniums ago among a populace who worshipped Isis and Osiris. It was Persia's best milch cow, but she had been foolish enough to treat the native deities with scorn. Hence, beneath outward calm, Egypt was seething with insurrection, and Alexander appeared almost as a liberator. The satrap had heard the news of Issus, the headlong flight of Darius, and the submission or sack of the cities of Syria and Phoenicia, and no doubt, fearing lest he should meet with a fate similar to that of Battus at Gaza, he surrendered Egypt to the king as soon as he appeared upon the frontier. Alexander had ridden by land with his army, while the fleet sailed to Pelusium. He garrisoned Pelusium and sent the fleet up the Nile to the capital, Memphis, then a fair and flourishing city, the rival of Babylon and Susa, 14 miles south of the site of the present Cairo. After a journey across the desert to take Heliopolis, the sacred city of the sun, Alexander too went to Memphis, where he pleased the natives by sacrificing to Ptah and Apis. The Greek gods were gratified by games and a musical festival, to which famous athletes and artists came from Greece at the king's summon. He did not stay long among the glories of Memphis, but set about one of those enormous practical projects which prove him as much ruler as conqueror. Among the Persian treasures taken after Issus was an extremely rich casket, in which Alexander had decided that nothing less precious than his copy of Homer's Iliad might be kept. Homer, pleased with this little attention, proved, as Plutarch says, neither an idle nor an unprofitable companion to him. An old gray-headed man appeared one night in a vision, and recited to him this verse from the Odyssey: "An island lies where loud the billows roar, Pharos they call it on the Egyptian shore." Alexander had decided to settle a Greek colony in Egypt, and had for some time been pondering where it should be. This dream, he said, resolved its doubts. Pharos, where the Ptolemies afterward built the famous lighthouse which became one of the 7 wonders of the world in the place of the Great Wall of Babylon, destroyed long before, was to be the site of the new city of Alexandria. Alexander had foreseen that a new port on the Mediterranean might grow up to take the place from which Tyre had fallen, and therefore he placed the Greek city, which he built to hold down Egypt, upon the coast. He chose Pharos, then an island, now an isthmus, as the most easterly point at which it was practicable to build a seaport, it being just out of the reach of the heavy deposits from the mouths of the Nile. As Pharos was seen to be too small, he founded his city, in 331 B.C., on the mainland opposite, where the town of Alexandria stands today, between Lake Mariotis and the sea. The king led the way, and one following him scattered barley as he went, to mark the boundaries. A flock of birds carried away these grains, and Aristander, who attended Alexander wherever he went as soothsayer, foretold from the omens that strangers would flock to the new city, and that it would nourish many countries. Alexander himself marked out the site of the marketplace and temples, and appointed the gods to whom the temples were to be dedicated. Until the foundation of Cairo in the 10th century, and to a large extent until the discovery of the route to India by the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, Alexandria was the greatest trading city in the world. Until Egypt became a Roman province in the 1st century B.C., it had also enormous political importance. It was the capital of the Ptolemies until Cleopatra came to her end, and was known for subtlety, refinement, gaiety, and vice more strangely mixed than in Rome in the days of Nero or France under the last Valois. The residence there of the Ptolemies also made Alexandria the capital of Greek culture, and so it remained until the conquest of Egypt by Mohammedans in the 7th century A.D. The Egyptian climate was peculiarly suited to the preservation of antiquities, and it would be difficult to estimate the world's debt to Egypt for the preservation of manuscript copies of the Greek classics, even as the earliest Greek paintings saved to us are those of mummy faces in Egyptian tombs. We should know much less of the Greeks had Alexander not conquered Egypt. After the rule of the Ptolemies had long passed away, Alexandria was the stage for many important events in the early development of Christianity. Here they sought to break St. Catherine on the wheel. Here Arianism raged, and here the learned Hypatia suffered death at the hands of the Christian mob. Alexandria was to be associated with ends which Alexander could not have foreseen, but its founding was a great conception, and its success points to the sagacity of the founder. His city rising, Alexander left Cleomenes in charge, but one important act remained to be done in Egypt. The ancient pharaohs had been sons of Ammon, and Alexander wished to conciliate the natives of what would be his second richest province by becoming a son of Ammon in his turn. This act of affiliation was never understood, and created almost as great a scandal as if an English administrator of Egypt today should turn Mohammedan. The motive which modern minds ascribe to the king was never guessed at by the men of his time. There was a deep mental chasm between this commander and his soldiery, and even between him and his generals, and they believed in their ignorance that he wished to set himself above ordinary humanity. In the only serious revolt which Alexander ever had to face, the army bade him go and conquer with his father Ammon. Alexander never explained the motives of his actions. He was always right, and he insisted on unquestioning obedience, and therefore he left the Macedonians in their ignorance, an ignorance at which he could hardly complain, for it served him better than if his followers had known his aims. Even a pretense to deity brought with it some political advantage. but once when he was wounded he said to some of his intimate friends, "This, my friends, is real flowing blood, not ichor, such as immortal gods are wont to shed." The oracle of Amen in the oasis of Siwa was one of the most famous in the ancient world. Perseus and Heracles had both visited it in their adventurous careers, and Alexander imitated them. He advanced from Alexandria along the desert track by the coast for about 180 miles to Peritonium, where he received the submission of Cyrene. Then he turned inland. The way lay south over burning, shifting sands, with never a tree or a hill for a landmark, and where neither rain fell nor dew. When Cambyses led his army that way, it was said the whole desert rose like a sea, and 50,000 were swallowed up in the sands. On the third day water fell short, but miracles, even the best authorities say, befell the Macedonians. Rain fell. Ravens or snakes, there are different accounts, appeared and led the way, and the party arrived at the oasis of Amen. In this delightful spot of palm and fountain, the king sought the oracle, and obtained from him the confirmation of his sacred status as an Egyptian sovereign. He told his followers that the oracle had told him many important things that he could not divulge, and gave them permission to question it in their turn. The state of their minds may be guessed from the fact that one and all asked the priest if Alexander were really of divine origin, and were one and all informed that they were to treat him as son of Amen. Some words which Alexander is reported to have let fall are the best commentary on this episode. God, he said, was the common father of us all, but more particularly of the best of us. It was from this time that some of the Macedonians dated Alexander's unbearable lordliness. Ready as they were to honor the representative of the tribe in all due and accustomed ways, they were fiercely opposed to any assumption on his part of Oriental monarchical manners. The Greek was unhappy in the service of a despot, and their young king was becoming a despot. Some, however, think that this change only came after Susa and Persepolis fell into his hands, and the great king had died a miserable death in abject flight before him. The Macedonian nobles, whom Alexander was raising up to be rulers of mighty provinces as he went on, were many of them to feel with the nurse in Medea. Rude are the wills of princes, yea, prevailing always, seldom crossed. On fitful wings their moods are tossed. 'Tis best men tread the equal way. I, not with glory, but with peace, may the long summers find me crowned. For gentleness, her very sound is magic, and her usages all wholesome. But the fiercely great hath little music on his road, and falleth when the hand of God shall move most deep and desolate. The son of Ammon returned from the oasis to Memphis, where he assumed the pageant of Pharaoh. Ambassadors of the Greek states, who had sent a golden crown to the conqueror after Issus, had come to seek favors, and recruits sent by Antipater arrived. In Egypt, Alexander established a government of divided command, not being willing to entrust this rich province to a single person. The Romans followed Alexander's policy in this, never sending any man of proconsular rank to administer Egypt, their granary. In the spring of 331 B.C., the king left Egypt and marched back into Phoenicia. At Tyre his fleet met him, and great celebrations and games were again held. Here at last he granted the Athenians' request for the release of their fellow citizens. Several honors were bestowed, and Ptolemy, who was afterward to rule over Egypt, became at this time one of the chief bodyguards. Then the king struck into the interior for his final struggle with Persia. End of chapter 7.